In the quiet English village, where nothing ever happens, a house stands at the end of the lane with its door locked for 4 long years. 9 milk bottles rot on the step. The widow inside has vanished without a trace. Then a sunburnt nephew arrives from Kenya claiming inheritance, and a dazzling blonde steps off the train, announcing she is the colonel's secret second wife. Murder, bigamy, hidden letters in an ancient apple tree, a bronze Buddha dripping with blood, and a body concealed in a trunk beneath the summer-house floor. Only one person sees the pattern in the chaos. A gentle, white-haired spinster with knitting needles and the sharpest mind in England. This is the story of the widow who never answered the door, and the deadly secrets that finally forced it open. Chapter 1. The house at the end of the lane Limstock Priors lay sleepily under a pale autumn sun. A sort of English village that appeared to have been designed by someone who had taken the commandments about peace and quiet rather literally. The high street curved gently between 2 rows of half-timber-bird cottages. The church crouched behind a screen of yew trees, and at the far end, where the lane narrowed and the hedges grew high and untidy, stood Rowanbank. It was a small, red-brick villa of the type built by retired colonels who believed that a man's house should be his fortress and his garden his parade ground. A clipped beech hedge enclosed it. The gate was painted a particularly aggressive shade of green. The brass letterbox gleamed like a guardsman's buckle. In the days of Colonel Arthur Bantry, the curtains had been drawn back at 7 sharp every morning, and the brass knocker had received its daily polish before the church clock finished striking 8. The colonel had died 4 years ago. Apoplexy, in the middle of abusing the gardener for planting sweet williams too close to the lupins. And since then Rowanbank had changed in one respect only. Its front door had remained closed. Mrs. Eleanor Bantry was still in residence. No one doubted that. The chimneys occasionally smoked, the bedroom curtains were drawn at dusk, and once or twice a month the maid, Clara, might be seen hurrying to the post office with a list, her mouth prim as a drawn purse string. Yet no visitor had crossed the threshold since the day of the funeral. The vicar had called with a volume of consolatory sermons and been told Madame was lying down. The district visitor had brought calf's foot jelly and been informed, through the letterbox, that Madame did not care for jelly. Even old Miss Hurst, who had known Eleanor since they were girls together at Cheltenham, had been turned away with the murmured excuse of a headache. Villages are patient. At first they said, "Poor Mrs. Bantry, she feels it dreadfully." After a 12-month they said, "She is becoming eccentric," but then widows often do. After 2 years they began to watch the house, rather as one watches a clock that has stopped, with a mixture of curiosity and unease. On this particular October afternoon, the usual knot of persons with time on their hands had gathered in the Blue Parrot tea-rooms, an establishment run by Miss Talbot, who had once been in musical comedy and still retained a taste for crimson plush and gilt chairs. Mrs. Dane Callery, whose tongue was insured, so she claimed at Lloyd's, was holding forth. "She has not been outside her own gate for 18 months, she announced, lowering her voice only sufficiently to assure that everyone present could hear. 18 months. Clara buys everything, even to ribbon and embroidery silk, and the curtains never move except when they are drawn at night. Some people like solitude," murmured Miss Lavinia Hurst, who herself liked it very much. "Solitude!" Mrs. Dane Callery gave a small triumphant sniff. "There is solitude and solitude. My cousin's boy delivered a parcel there last week, registered from Aspreys, and rang and knocked till his knuckles were sore. Not a sound. He left it on the step. It stayed there until Clara came sneaking out after dark to fetch it in. Mr. Pauke, the constable, who had been lingering over a cup of coffee in the hope of a second piece of Miss Talbot's walnut cake, cleared his throat. "No law against keeping your own front door shut, ma'am?" "Perhaps not," said Mrs. Dane Callery darkly, "but there is something very odd about it all the same." At the little table by the window, half hidden behind a potted fern, sat Miss Jane Marple. She wore dove-gray wool and was engaged upon a complicated baby's coat in pale primrose. Her needles clicked steadily. Her soft white hair was as neatly waved as ever. Her mild blue eyes traveled gently from face to face as the conversation flowed round her. She said nothing at all. She only listened, and remembered that Eleanor Bantry had once been the most punctual woman in the county, that she had never in her life suffered from headaches, and that she had always opened her own front door to visitors with a brisk, "Well, come in or stay out, but don't stand there letting the cold into the house." Miss Marple finished a row, turned her knitting, and began another. Outside, the sun slipped behind a cloud, and the leaves of the Virginia creeper on Rowan Bank's porch turned from scarlet to blood color. Somewhere in the quiet village a clock struck 4. The door of Rowan Bank remained shut, as it had remained shut for 4 long years, and would, some people were beginning to think, remain shut forever. Chapter 2. The Matter of the Milk Bills. In villages, the milkman is the truest chronicler of domestic life. He sees who is up with the lark, and who lies abed till 10, whose household is lavish with cream, and whose has fallen upon skim days, whose bottles are rinsed and returned, and whose are left to sour in the sun. In Limstock Priors, the milkman was Ted Willow, 19 years old, freckled, and possessed of lungs that could whistle the whole of Colonel Bogey before he reached the first gate. Every morning at 6:30, he pedaled his red tricycle along the lane, clinking bottles like a muted glass bell. On Tuesday, the 14th of October, he found 3 full bottles on the step at Rowan Bank. This was unusual. Mrs. Bantry, or Clara acting under her orders, always took the milk in the moment it was set down. Ted whistled louder, partly to warn the household he was there, and partly because he liked the echo of the high hedge. No curtain twitched. He left the fresh bottle, gathered the 3 empties that should have been there, and went on his way. Wednesday brought 4 bottles untouched. Thursday 5. By Friday morning, the step presented a small white regiment of 9 bottles, some already filmed with yesterday's cream turning yellow. Ted knocked with the cheerful abandon of youth. No answer. He knocked again, using the knocker this time, rat-tat-tat, the sound sharp as a sergeant major's stick. Still nothing. He went round to the kitchen door and shaded his eyes to peer through the window. The kitchen was immaculate. Copper pans winked from their hooks. The flagstones had been scrubbed so hard that the red tiles looked pink. The cat, a large black and white animal named, so Clara had once let slip Field Marshal, sat on the table washing its whiskers with the complacent air of one who has never missed a meal in its life. Everything was precisely as it should be, except that no human hand had touched those bottles for the better part of a week. Ted cycled back to the dairy in a state of high excitement. His mother, who acted as bookkeeper and universal conscience to the business, listened with tightening lips. 9 bottles, she repeated. Mrs. Bantry never wastes a drop. When the Colonel was alive, she used to stand at the door and count them out loud, 1 for breakfast, 2 for puddings, 1 for the cat. Something's wrong, Ted. Ted, who had hoped for drama, was not disappointed. By 11 o'clock, the news had traveled the length of the high street and was being garnished with every retelling. Mrs. Dane Callery declared that Mrs. Bantry had very likely been murdered in her bed, and the maid was too terrified to speak. Miss Hurst suggested faint-heartedly that the poor woman might have had a stroke and be lying helpless upstairs. Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, was seen hurrying towards the police house with a face so grave that people crossed the road to avoid meeting his eye. Constable Pauk, a large, slow man who preferred parking offences to anything that might disturb his digestion, listened to the growing chorus with gloom. He had no particular liking for Mrs. Bantry. She had once reported him for allowing his bicycle to lean against her. Gatepost but 9 uncollected milk bottles constituted what he privately classified as a situation. At 12:30, he put on his helmet, took his notebook, and walked down the lane to Rowan Bank. He knocked with official deliberation. He knocked again. He tried the knocker, the bell, and finally the kitchen window. The cat looked at him through the glass with yellow, disdainful eyes and went on washing. Constable Pock walked all round the house, peering at windows, testing the back door, locked, examining the coal shed, also locked, though the key lay beneath the obvious flower pot where it had always lain. He came back to the front step, stared hard at the 9 bottles, as though they might confess, and wrote laboriously in his notebook. No reply. Premises appear secure. Cat alive and well. That evening, after surgery hours, Dr. Haydock was buttoning his British warm in the hall of his house when Constable Pock waylaid him. "It's about Mrs. Bantry, Doctor. Those milk bottles. 9 of them. And no sign of life." D.R. Haydock was a tall Scot with a dry manner and a pair of gray eyes that saw more than most people supposed. He had attended Colonel Bantry in his last apoplectic seizure and had signed the certificate without hesitation. He had also attended Mrs. Bantry from time to time for what she called nerves, and he called too much attention to her own symptoms. He had not been summoned to Rowanbank for over a year. 9 bottles, he repeated. That's decisive enough, even for Limstock priors. Have you a key? Under the geranium pot by the coal shed. Always kept there. Then we'll use it. They met at 9 o'clock, when the village was settling into its evening coma. The moon had risen, thin and chill, throwing long shadows across the lane. Dr. Haydock carried an electric torch. Constable Pock his official lantern, and a strong sense of trespass. The key turned sweetly in the lock. The door opened with no more than its usual faint sigh. The hall smelled of lavender polish and the particular stuffy stillness that comes from windows too rarely opened. The grandfather clock ticked solemnly, marking time for a house that had forgotten it. On the console table lay a little pile of letters and a brown paper parcel addressed in a London hand. Everything was in perfect order, yet the order had a frozen look, like a museum diorama. "Mrs. Bantry?" called Dr. Haydock, raising his voice just enough to be polite. "Clara?" Silence answered him, thick and undisturbed. They moved through the house with the careful steps of men who expect at any moment to stumble upon something unpleasant. Drawing room. Fire laid but not lit. Cushions plunked. Copies of The Field and the Lady arranged in exact fans upon the tables. Dining room. Silver gleaming. Table laid for one with the precision of a sergeant laying out kit for inspection. Kitchen. Saucepans in descending sizes. Cat now eating cold liver from a saucer with regal unconcern. Upstairs. The big front bedroom with its mahogany half-tester bed made up so tightly that a sixpence would have bounced upon the blanket. Wardrobe doors revealing rows of black dresses hanging like a regiment of mourners. Dressing table set out with military neatness hairbrushes back to back. Photograph of the late colonel in dress uniform staring sternly from a silver frame. No sign of Clara. No sign of Mrs. Bantry. No sign that anyone had slept in the bed or eaten at the table or opened a single letter for at least a week. Constable Pock blew out his cheeks. "Gone," he said helplessly. "Both of them. Clean gone." Dr. Haydock stood in the middle of the bedroom and turned slowly on his heel, taking in every detail with those cool gray eyes. At last he said, "No, Pock, not gone. Taken." He did not explain the difference, but the word hung in the quiet air like a drop of icy water. It was then that he remembered Miss Marple. She had been a friend of Eleanor Bantry's in their youth. She had an inconvenient habit of being right about things no one else had noticed, and she lived only 3 doors away from his own house. He left Constable Pock to lock up and walked quickly through the moonlit lane. Miss Marple was still up, reading by the fire with her knitting in her lap. She listened without interruption while Dr. Haydock told his story, her mild blue eyes never leaving his face. When he had finished, she laid the knitting aside and folded her hands. 9 bottles, she said softly. How very unlike Eleanor Bantry. She was always most precise about waste. And Clara would never have left the cat to go hungry. No, doctor, you are quite right. Someone has taken them both. Or one of them has been taken, and the other silenced. She rose and went to the window, drawing back the curtain to look towards the dark bulk of Rowanbank at the end of the lane. Poor Eleanor, she murmured. She always did dislike a fuss. But I am afraid, doctor, that a fuss is now inevitable. Outside, the moon sailed coldly above the clipped beech hedge, and the 9 milk bottles stood in a silent white line upon the step, waiting for a hand that would never come again. Chapter 3. The Breaking of the Door. The following morning, Lymstock Priors woke to find itself famous in a modest county way. A reporter from the Much Benham Herald had arrived by the early bus and was attempting to interview Constable Pauk outside the police house. Pauk, who had never before been interviewed, kept repeating that the matter was under consideration, while trying to edge towards the sanctuary of his kitchen. By 10 o'clock, the news had reached the breakfast tables of 3 adjoining parishes, and by 11, the chief constable himself had telephoned from Much Benham to say that Inspector Graves would be down on the 12.17. In the meantime, the village settled down to enjoy its sensation with the solemn relish of those who have waited 4 quiet years for something to happen. At 9:30, Dr. Haydock called again at Miss Marple's cottage. She was in the garden tying up chrysanthemums, a scarf knotted under her chin against the wind. I have persuaded Pauk, he said without preamble, that we ought to look once more before Graves arrives and starts turning the place inside out. Will you come? Miss Marple straightened, considered the sky, which threatened rain, fetched an umbrella, and announced herself quite ready. They walked down the lane together. Constable Pauk was already at the gate of Rowanbank looking harassed. The 9 milk bottles had been joined by a 10th, delivered that morning by Ted Willow, out of sheer force of habit. I've had the baker here, Pauk said gloomily, and the postman. Baker left 2 loaves yesterday. Postman's got a registered packet needs signing for. Nobody answers. I told 'em all to leave things on the step. What else could I do? You could let us in, said Dr. Haydock. Pauk produced the key from under the geranium pot with the air of a man performing a conjuring trick he already regrets. The door opened as silently as before. The 3 of them stepped into the hall and paused, listening. The house felt watchful. This time they went through it more thoroughly. Miss Marple moved with the quiet deliberation of a connoisseur in an exhibition she has visited many times before. She noted the thin film of dust on the hall table where the letters and parcels lay exactly as they had lain the night before. She opened the drawing-room door and stood a moment on the threshold. Fire still laid, she murmured, but no one has touched it since Thursday at latest. Look at the coal scuttle. The coals have that dry, dull look they get when they have been handled several days ago. In the dining room, the single place at the table was still set. Knife, fork, spoon, salt cellar, a small glass dish containing 3 lumps of sugar. The bread bin held half a loaf, now hard. In the kitchen, the cat greeted them with loud complaints and wound itself round Miss Marple's ankles. Poor field marshal, she said, stroking it. Clara would never have left you without making provision. Your dishes are clean and dry. Upstairs they found the same immaculate emptiness. The beds were made, the towels hung in perfect folds. In Mrs. Bantry's room, the dressing-table drawers were shut, but when Miss Marple opened the top one, she gave a small exclamation. Look, she said. On the folded handkerchiefs lay a small mother-of-pearl revolver, fully loaded. Dr. Haydock whistled softly. The Colonel's old service revolver was a Webley. This is a lady's gun. Eleanor was always afraid of burglars after the Colonel died, Miss Marple said. She told me once she kept it in that drawer, but she was a soldier's wife. She would never have left it there if she had intended to go away. And she certainly would not have gone without locking it in its case. They searched the rest of the house. In Clara's little room over the kitchen, the bed was made, the nightdress folded beneath the pillow, a small suitcase open and half packed on the chair, as though someone had been interrupted in the act. 2 dresses lay across the bed, and a pair of stout walking shoes stood neatly side by side. Downstairs again, Miss Marple paused in the study, a small dark room lined with books on military campaigns and big game hunting. The bronze Buddha from the mantelpiece was missing. In its place, a pale patch showed where it had stood. It went out into the garden. The beds were neat, the paths freshly raked, the leaves swept into tidy heaps. At the far end stood the summer house, a fanciful octagonal erection, painted white and green. The door was locked. "Curious," said Dr. Haydock. "Everything else left open or carelessly fastened, yet this is locked." Constable Pauk produced a bunch of keys taken from the kitchen drawer. The third fitted. The door swung open with a faint creak. Inside, the summer house was furnished with basket chairs and faded cretonne cushions. A small table held a work basket and several balls of wool. On the floor lay a small brass-bound trunk. Miss Marple knelt stiffly and tried the lid. Locked. Dr. Haydock looked round. "There's a hook on the wall where a key used to hang. It's gone." They stood in silence. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistled as it approached Limstock Station. Inspector Graves would be on it. Miss Marple rose handily. "I think," she said quietly, "we had better wait for the proper authorities before we force that trunk. But I should like to look once more in the ice house." The ice house was an old brick-lined pit behind the summer house, half underground, with a heavy wooden trap-door now overgrown with ivy. Colonel Bantry had used it in the days before electric refrigerators to store venison and game. The trap-door was fastened by a stout wooden bar. Constable Pauk lifted the bar and pulled. The trap-door came up with a groan of rusty hinges. A flight of brick steps led down into darkness. Dr. Haydock switched on his torch. The beam traveled slowly over the empty pit, picked out the iron meat hooks still hanging from the roof, moved across the floor, and stopped. At the foot of the steps lay a woman's black kid shoe, neatly buttoned, lying on its side as though someone had just stepped out of it. Miss Marple drew a long breath. "Poor Eleanor," she said very softly. She always was most particular about her shoes. Above them the October wind stirred the ivy, and somewhere in the house the grandfather clock struck the quarter, clear and indifferent, as though nothing in the world had changed. Chapter 4. The nephew from Kenya. Inspector Graves arrived at 23 minutes past 12. A thin, neat man with a clipped mustache and the resigned expression of one who has been dragged away from a perfectly good game of golf. He listened to Constable Pauk's report without comment, examined the single kid shoe with a magnifying glass, and sent for a police photographer and 2 sergeants from Much Benham. The ice house was sealed. The house was sealed. The village, which had hoped for an immediate arrest and a satisfactory corpse, was obliged to possess its soul in patience. In the meantime, life in Limstock Priors adjusted itself to the presence of policemen. Children were shooed away from the gates of Rowanbank. Reporters were fobbed off with cups of tea and non-committal smiles. Mrs. Dane Callery developed a convenient heart murmur, which required her to rest upon a sofa while receiving a constant stream of visitors. On the 3rd day after the discovery of the shoe, a new figure arrived by the 3.17 train. He was tall, bronzed, and dressed with the careless elegance of a man who has spent years where tailors are scarce and sun is plentiful. A porter carried his pigskin suitcases. The station master touched his cap. The taxi driver greeted him with a deference due to a gentleman who tipped in 10-shilling notes. He gave his name at the Blue Boar as Richard Bantry, only nephew of the late Colonel Arthur Bantry, and announced his intention of proceeding at once to Rowanbank to see what the devil was going on. Inspector Graves received him in the drawing-room of Rowanbank, now stripped of its dust sheets and looking oddly naked under the eyes of officialdom. Richard Bantry strode in, tossed his solar topee onto a chair, and demanded to know why his aunt's house had been turned into a police station. Graves, who had met his sort before, explained with courteous firmness that Mrs. Eleanor Bantry and her maid had disappeared, that certain articles of clothing had been found, and that until the matter was cleared up, Rowanbank must be regarded as the scene of a crime. Richard Bantry listened with every appearance of astonishment. He had, he said, been planting coffee in the Kenyan highlands for the past 8 years, and had heard nothing from his aunt for the last 6 months, except a brief note refusing to advance him £200. He had decided to come home on long leave, had written to say he would arrive about this time, and had naturally expected to find Aunt Eleanor in residence, probably wearing the same black dress she had worn since 1931. "And Clara?" asked Graves. "Clara? Oh, the maid. Still here, I suppose. Aunt Eleanor would never part with her. Clara came out to India with them in 1912 and has been ruling the household ever since." He looked round the room with a frank, appraising eye that took in the Waterford glass, the Sheridan sideboard, the small Fragonard above the mantelpiece. "Everything seems in order," he said. "When can I move in?" Graves explained, with a certain relish, that no one would be moving in until the chief constable gave permission, and that might be some weeks. Richard Bantry swore softly under his breath, accepted the situation with a shrug, and booked himself a room at the Blue Boar. That evening he dined at the hotel with the air of a man determined to make the best of things. He drank whiskey and soda with the ease of long practice, told stories of lion hunting and white mischief on the equator, and allowed the entire bar to stand him drinks in exchange for the latest news from Rowanbank, which was no news at all. Miss Marple, who had been persuaded by her nephew Raymond to take a glass of sherry before dinner. "You'll be the only person in the place who hasn't heard his stories." Aunt Jane watched the newcomer from her corner table. He was, she decided, a very personable young man in his way, 35 perhaps, with a broken nose that somehow added rather than detracted, and the easy manner of one born to command native bearers and charm Memsahides. Yet there was something about the set of his shoulders, when he thought himself unobserved, a kind of calculating watchfulness, that reminded her of a big cat she had once seen in a cage at the zoo, beautiful, sleepy-eyed, and quite capable of killing you if the bars were removed. Later, when the bar had emptied and the landlord was locking up, Richard Bantry strolled out into the moonlit street for a cigarette. He paused beneath the inn sign, looked up and down the silent high street, and then walked briskly in the direction of Rowanbank. Miss Marple, who had lingered over her coffee, saw him go. She sat a moment longer, turning her cup in its saucer, then rose, fetched her umbrella from the stand, and followed at a discreet distance. The lane was dark, overhung with trees. Richard Bantry's tall figure moved swiftly ahead. At the gate of Rowanbank he stopped, glanced round once, and then slipped through the side entrance used by tradesmen. A moment later Miss Marple heard the faint scrape of a window being raised. She did not attempt to follow further. She stood in the shadow of the beech hedge, listening. There was a soft thud, the creak of a floorboard, then silence. 10 minutes passed. 20. A constable on night patrol came swinging his lantern along the lane, humming under his breath. Miss Marple stepped forward. "Good evening, Harris," she said pleasantly. Such a mild night for the time of year. Police Constable Harris touched his helmet, startled. "Evening, Miss Marple. You're about late." "I have been visiting a sick friend," said Miss Marple, who had not left the Blue Boar until 10 minutes ago. "Tell me, Harris, has anyone been past here in the last half hour?" Harris considered. "Only Major Bantry, miss. Came down from the Blue Boar, looked at the house a bit, and went back the way he came. Sighed he couldn't sleep and fancied a stroll." "How very natural," said Miss Marple. She watched Harris continue his beat, then turned and walked thoughtfully home. In her little sitting room, she took a sheet of notepaper and wrote in her neat, slanting hand, "My dear Dr. Haydock, the nephew has been in the house tonight. He entered by the scullery window. I saw the marks on the sill when I passed this afternoon. He was inside for nearly 25 minutes. I do not know what he wanted, but I feel sure he found it. Yours very sincerely, Jane Marple." She sealed the note, addressed it, and laid it on the hall table ready for the early post. Outside, the wind had risen, rattling the windows of Rowanbank, where the police sergeant sat dozing over his notebook. And somewhere in the darkness, a branch scraped against glass like a hand trying to attract attention. Richard Bantry, back in his room at the Blue Boar, poured himself a nightcap, raised the glass to the photograph of a smiling girl in riding kit that stood on his dressing table, and smiled himself a small, satisfied smile that did not reach his eyes. "Poor old Aunt Eleanor," he said softly. "Always said you were too clever by half." He drank, set down the glass, and began to count a thick wad of 5-pound notes he had taken from an inner pocket. Chapter 5. The second Mrs. Bantry, the inquest on the single kid shoe, for no body had yet been found, was held in the parish room on a wet Thursday, and lasted exactly 23 minutes. The jury, having been warned by the coroner that they were not trying a novel by Mrs. Christie, brought in the only possible verdict, that the shoe belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Bantry, and that there was no evidence to show whether she was alive or dead. The village filed out into the drizzle feeling cheated. That same afternoon, a taxicab from Much Benham station drew up with a splendid hiss of wet tires outside the Blue Boar. Door opened, and a woman stepped down who caused even Lynstock Priors to catch its breath. She was tall, dressed in a cherry-red coat with a fur collar, and wore a small hat tilted over one eye. Her hair was the color of ripe corn, her lips were the color of the coat, and her eyelashes were so dark and thick that Mrs. Dane Callery, watching from the post-office window, declared afterwards that they must be false and probably stuck on with seccotine. The stranger paid the driver with a 5-pound note, told him airily to keep the change, and sailed into the Blue Boar, asking for the manager. 5 minutes later the manager was bowing her into the private sitting room, and sending the boots for Richard Bantry with a note marked urgent. Richard came down 2 steps at a time, burst into the room, and stopped dead. "Veronica," he said. The lady turned, opened her arms, and laughed. "Dickie, darling, surprise." They embraced with the enthusiasm of people who have not seen each other for some years, and have no objection to being watched. The boots, lingering in the doorway, was rewarded by a wink and a 6pence. When the first transports were over, Richard held her at arm's length. "What in the name of heaven are you doing here?" Veronica removed her hat, shook out her corn-gold hair, and sat down on the sofa. "I read about poor Eleanor in the Nairobi papers," she said. "Disappeared, house sealed, police baffled, handsome nephew arrived from Kenya. Well, naturally, I caught the first boat." Richard stared. "You read about me?" "My dear, you were the only part worth reading." She opened her handbag, produced a silver cigarette case, and lit a gasper with a flourish. "I always said you took after your uncle. He had the devil's own luck, too, until the end." Richard closed the door carefully and lowered his voice. "You can't stay here, Veronica." "It's impossible." "Nonsense." She blew a perfect smoke ring. "I have every right. I happen to be Mrs. Arthur Bantry." There was a moment's silence, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "You're what?" said Richard at last. "The second Mrs. Bantry," she repeated cheerfully. "Didn't the old boy ever mention me?" "We were married in Nairobi Registry Office, April 1919. He told me his first wife had divorced him. Apparently the decree was not quite absolute." She laughed again, a delightful gurgling sound. "Bigamy is so untidy, isn't it?" Richard sat down rather suddenly. "You mean to say you are legally—" "My dear Dickie, I haven't the faintest idea. But I intend to find out. And until someone proves I'm not Mrs. Bantry, I propose to behave as though I am. I've booked the best bedroom, ordered a fire and a bottle of champagne, and sent a note to the police inspector asking him to call at his earliest convenience. She leaned forward and patted his knee. Don't look so Friday-faced. Think of the money, darling. Half the estate, at the very least. Richard opened his mouth, shut it again, and reached for the whiskey decanter. That evening the Blue Boar dining room presented a scene of restrained magnificence. Veronica, now wearing black velvet, and the Bantry diamonds which she said she had happened to find in an old jewel case at the bank, sat at the best table with Richard on her right, and Inspector Graves, who had accepted an invitation he now regretted, on her left. Conversation was general, and on the surface, gay. Underneath it crackled like cat ice. Miss Marple, dining frugally on sole and stewed apple at her small table by the window, observed everything. She noted that Richard drank 3 whiskeys before the soup, and that his eyes kept straying to the diamonds at Veronica's throat. She noted that Veronica herself ate almost nothing, but talked continually, dropping little anecdotes about life in Kenya, which made the inspector blink and the waitress blush. She noted, finally, that when the coffee was served, Veronica leaned towards Graves and said clearly, "Of course, Inspector, I quite understand that poor Eleanor may have taken her own life. Grief, solitude, perhaps a guilty conscience. One hears of such things." Graves murmured something non-committal. "Though personally," Veronica went on, "I should look closer to home. Servants, you know. One never can tell. That maid of hers, Clara, such a sullen creature. And then there is family." She smiled sweetly at Richard. "Nephews can be so greedy." Richard choked over his brandy. At 10 o'clock, Miss Marple rose to go. As she passed their table, she paused. "Good evening, Major Bantry. Good evening, Mrs. A." Veronica looked up with a dazzling smile. "Fielding Bantry, actually, though I dare say the hyphen is a little irregular." She held out a hand glittering with rings. "You must be the famous Miss Marple. Dickie has told me all about you." "Indeed?" said Miss Marple mildly. "How very indiscreet of him." She shook the proffered hand, felt the hard pressure of a diamond against her palm, and went on her way. In the hall she encountered Dr. Haydock, come to fetch her home. "Well?" he asked. Miss Marple considered. "A most interesting development," she said at last. "2 claimants to the same inheritance, and neither of them, I fancy, particularly scrupulous. And both of them convinced that Eleanor is dead." Haydock helped her into her coat. "You think she is?" "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple simply. "I have thought so ever since we found the shoe. Eleanor Bantry would never have walked down those damp brick steps without both shoes buttoned. Someone carried her. They stepped out into the wet night. Behind them, through the lighted windows of the dining room, they could see Veronica laughing at something the inspector had said, and Richard staring into his glass as though he saw a ghost at the bottom of it. The rain had stopped. A thin moon rode high over Rowanbank, silvering the wet leaves and the blank windows that stared at nothing. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and was silent. Miss Marple drew her scarf closer. "2 Mrs. Bantrys," she murmured, "and neither of them the real one. Poor Eleanor. She always hated a fuss, and now she is to be the center of the most dreadful fuss of all." Chapter 6. The letter in the writing desk. The following morning broke clear and frosty. Lymstock Priors, having digested the arrival of the second Mrs. Bantry, now waited with the patient gree of a cat at a mouse-hole for the next act. Inspector Graves, who had spent a largely sleepless night wondering how many more wives the late Colonel might have accumulated between the Nile and the Zambesi, decided that a thorough search of Rowanbank could be postponed no longer. He obtained the necessary authority, posted a constable at the gate with strict instructions to admit no one without written permission, and prepared to begin. Miss Marple, however, had ideas of her own. She presented herself at the Blue Boar at 10:30, carrying a small string bag and wearing an expression of elderly determination. The second Mrs. Bantry, still in a cherry-colored dressing gown and an aura of nuit de Newell, was breakfasting in bed. Richard Bantry had gone for a long walk, ostensibly to clear his head. "I have remembered," Miss Marple announced to the manager, "that poor Mrs. Bantry once asked me to look after a little matter for her if anything should happen. A packet, I fancy, left in the Colonel's writing desk. I feel sure the police would wish me to recover it at once." The manager, torn between terror of Inspector Graves and terror of Miss Marple, telephoned Rowanbank. Graves, who had met Miss Marple before, sighed deeply and said she might have 10 minutes in the study under supervision. Miss Marple accepted the condition with a gentle smile. The study smelled of leather, tobacco, and the particular stuffiness that gathers in rooms where men have written letters about polo ponies and the price of ivory. The big knee-hole desk stood in the window. Its green leather top was scarred with the burns of many careless cigarettes. Sergeant Lake stood by the door, notebook in hand, prepared to be stern. Miss Marple began opening drawers with the unhurried certainty of a woman who has tidied other people's houses since childhood. She found pipe cleaners, a box of .450 cartridges, a photograph of a polo team, the Colonel in the center, looking fierce, and in the bottom left-hand drawer, a bundle of old bank statements tied with pink tape. His center drawer was locked. "Ah," said Miss Marple, "this will be it." She produced from her string bag a small bunch of keys attached to a tarnished silver acorn. Sergeant Lake opened his mouth to protest, remembered that elderly ladies frequently possess odd keys, and shut it again. The third key turned sweetly. The drawer slid open. Inside lay a single sheet of notepaper, folded once. Miss Marple unfolded it and read aloud in her soft, precise voice, "If anything should happen to me, look in the old apple tree behind the summer-house. E.B." There was no date. Sergeant Lake took the paper gingerly between finger and thumb and sniffed it for fingerprints. Miss Marple closed the drawer, relocked it, and dropped the keys back into her bag. "I think," she said, "that Inspector Graves will wish to see the apple tree." The apple tree was a veteran, planted in the reign of George III. Its trunk split long ago by lightning, so that one half leaned away from the other, like an old man bending to listen to gossip. The hollow formed by the split was partly concealed by ivy. A constable was sent for a ladder. Another fetched a torch. Miss Marple stood quietly to one side, hands folded on the handle of her umbrella. The hollow was deeper than it looked. When the ivy had been pulled aside, the constable reached in and drew out a small tin cash-box bound with sticking plaster and wrapped in a piece of oilskin. The lock had rusted, but a jemmy made short work of it. Inside were 5 letters in a man's handwriting, the envelopes yellowed and brittle, and a marriage certificate. Inspector Graves read the certificate first. It was dated the 17th of April, 1919, and it recorded the marriage at the Nairobi Registry Office between Arthur Lionel Bantry, widower, and Veronica Mary Fielding, spinster. The letters were addressed to "My darling V" and signed A. They were affectionate, explicit, and quite unmistakably the letters of a man who believed himself free to marry again. Graves looked up. "So the Colonel was a bigamist." "It would appear so," said Miss Marple. "Though, I dare say, he convinced himself that the first marriage was over in every way that mattered. Men do, you know, when they are far from home and in love." Graves turned to the constable. "Get this to the house, and ask Major Bantry and Mrs. Fielding to attend at Rowanbank this afternoon. 4 o'clock. Miss Marple walked slowly back to the gate. On the way she paused by the summer-house. The door still stood ajar from the previous search. The police padlock hung open. She went in. The little room smelled of damp and mouse. The brass-bound trunk still stood in the corner. Miss Marple knelt, examined the lock, and then, with the air of one performing a minor conjuring trick, produced from her bag a short length of hairpin. The lid rose with a faint creak. Inside lay a black dress, neatly folded, a pair of black kid shoes, the fellow to the one in the ice house, and on top a small velvet bag. Miss Marple opened the bag and tipped its contents into her palm. A single emerald pendant set in diamonds. She sat back on her heels, considering. "Poor Eleanor," she said at last. "She always did dislike loose ends." She replaced the pendant, closed the trunk, and went out, pulling the door shut behind her. The constable on the gate saluted as she passed. She acknowledged the salute with a small nod and walked on down the lane, her umbrella tapping gently on the gravel like a conductor's baton, keeping time for a slow and solemn march. At 4 o'clock precisely, Richard Bantry and Veronica Fielding arrived at Rowanbank in the same taxi. They were not speaking. Veronica's face was pale beneath its makeup. Richard's jaw was set hard. Inspector Graves received them in the drawing-room. Miss Marple sat in the corner with her knitting, apparently absorbed in turning a heel. Graves wasted no words. "We have found a marriage certificate proving that Colonel Bantry married Miss Veronica Fielding in Nairobi, in Dongdae, 1919. The first Mrs. Bantry was, at that date, still alive. The second marriage was therefore bigamous, and any claim Mrs. Fielding may have on the estate is void." Veronica opened her mouth, thought better of it, and closed it again. Richard Bantry gave a short, angry laugh. "Well, that's one in the eye for you, Veronica." "On the contrary," said Graves quietly, "it leaves Major Bantry as the sole heir, provided, of course, that the first Mrs. Bantry is proved to be dead." He let the silence hang for a moment. "We shall begin draining the ice house tomorrow morning," he said. Richard's sunburn seemed suddenly to have faded. Veronica reached for a cigarette with fingers that trembled very slightly. Miss Marple laid down her knitting. "I think," she said gently, "that the ice house will be found to contain only ice." And one shoe. Every head turned towards her. "Eleanor Bantry," said Miss Marple, "was a soldier's wife." She faced facts. When she discovered those letters in the apple tree, she knew exactly what they meant. She also knew that her nephew was in England and short of money. She was not a foolish woman. She left a message for someone she trusted, myself, as it happens, and she prepared to meet him on her own terms. She paused, looked at Richard Bantry, and then at Veronica. "But someone else arrived first," she said softly. "Someone who had even more to lose than a mere inheritance." The ticking of the bracket clock sounded suddenly very loud in the quiet room. Outside, the frost glittered on the lawns of Rowanbank, and the old apple tree stood bare and secret against the wintry sky. Chapter 7. The truth in the summer house, the ice house, when they opened it at dawn, was exactly as Miss Marple had predicted. A damp, brick-lined pit smelling of leaf mold and ancient cold. A few inches of black water at the bottom, and one small black kid shoe lying forlornly on the second step. Nothing more. No body, no blood, no sign of a struggle. Only the shoe. Inspector Graves was annoyed. Richard Bantry, brought from the Blue Boar under escort, looked first relieved and then suspicious. Veronica, who had insisted on being present wrapped in silver fox, gave a delicate shiver and announced that she felt quite faint. No one paid her the slightest attention. Graves sent the constables to search the garden again, the attics, the coal cellar, even the water butt. They found nothing but a dead starling and Clara's second-best umbrella. By 11 o'clock, the inspector was reduced to questioning the cat. Miss Marple sat in the summer house with a cup of police cocoa, strong enough to stand a spoon in, and watched the search through the open door. She had asked permission very politely whether she might remain in case some little thing occurred to her, and Graves, remembering another case in another village, had given permission with a curt nod. At 11:30, Constable Pauk came panting across the lawn. "Beg pardon, sir," he reported to Graves, "but there's footprints, fresh ones, round the summer house." Someone's been here since the frost last night. Graves strode across. Miss Marple rose and followed at a decorous distance. The footprints were unmistakable. A man's heavy shooting brogues, the left one with a worn patch on the outer heel. They came from the direction of the lane, circled the summer house twice, and returned the same way. Graves looked grim. Major Bantry was wearing shooting brogues yesterday. He was, said Miss Marple quietly. But so, I fancy, do half the gentlemen in the county. Graves gave her a sharp glance, and then knelt, examining the path more closely. The footprints stopped abruptly at the summer house door. There were no corresponding prints leading away on the inside. Either he flew out, said Graves, or he took his shoes off. Or, said Miss Marple, someone carried him. She stepped inside the summer house. The brass-bound trunk still stood in the corner. The lid was closed, but the padlock hung open. "Inspector," she said, "would you be good enough to have 2 of your men lift this trunk? It is heavier than it looks." Graves signaled. 2 constables grasped the leather handles and heaved. The trunk came up with difficulty. "Empty yesterday," grunted one. "Not now," said the other. They set it down. Graves threw back the lid. Richard Bantry lay inside, curled like a child in a too small cradle, his knees drawn up, his hands bound behind him with picture cord, a strip of sticking plaster across his mouth. His eyes, very wide and very blue, stared up at them with an expression of furious helplessness. Veronica, peering over Graves's shoulder, gave one piercing scream and fainted with considerable artistry into the arms of the nearest constable. Richard was lifted out, the gag removed, the cords cut. He sat on a basket chair, coughing and swearing, his face crimson. "Who the devil put me in there?" he roared. "That," said Graves, "is what we propose to find out." Richard gulped brandy from a constable's flask and became coherent. He had, he said, received an anonymous note at the Blue Boar the previous evening, pushed under his door. It was in typewriting. "If you want to know what really happened to your aunt, come to the summer house at midnight. Come alone." He had come. Someone had struck him from behind as he entered. He remembered nothing more until he woke to find himself trussed and gagged in the trunk. "The note," said Graves. "You still have it?" Richard felt in his pockets, produced a crumpled sheet, and handed it over. Graves read it and passed it to Miss Marple. The paper was cheap blue Baseline bond, the sort sold in every post office in England. The typing was faultless. "Interesting," said Miss Marple. "A Remington portable, I fancy. The letter E is slightly out of alignment." She folded the note, returned it, and looked thoughtfully at Richard. "You came alone?" "Completely. No one followed you?" "I shouldn't think so. I came through the side gate and across the vegetable garden." Miss Marple nodded. "And the trunk was open when you arrived?" "I didn't notice. It was dark. I had a torch, but the blow came the moment I stepped inside." Graves gave orders for the summer house to be searched again. They found Richard's torch under a cushion, still switched on, the battery almost exhausted. They found also, wedged behind the trunk, a bronze Buddha about 9 inches high, its base stained dark. Dr. Haydock, summoned hurriedly, examined the unconscious nephew. "Concussion," he said briefly. "He'll have a headache for a week, but he'll live." Richard was carried into the house and put to bed in the spare room under police guard. Veronica, revived with sal volatile, announced that she was prostrated with nervous shock and retired to the Blue Boar. Graves turned to Miss Marple. "Well?" Miss Marple sat down on one of the basket chairs and folded her hands. "Someone wished to remove Major Bantry from the scene for a time," she said. "Someone who knew that the discovery of the bigamous marriage had made him the sole heir, and a very dangerous person to have at large. You think he killed his aunt?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that he believed he had disposed of her very cleverly. He struck her down in the study with the Buddha, which is now back on the mantelpiece, wiped clean. hid the body temporarily in the ice house, and then arranged everything to look as though she had walked out of the house of her own accord. The milk bottles were his great mistake. Eleanor Bantry would never have allowed milk to stand. He put them there himself to suggest she was still inside, too ill or too eccentric to answer the door. And Clara? Clara surprised him. She came back unexpectedly, perhaps from an evening off, and saw what he was doing. He had to kill her too. Her body is probably in the lake at the bottom of Sir Henry Clithering's park. It will be found when the weeds die down. Graves looked at her with reluctant admiration. But why the charade last night? Because someone else knew. Someone who had even more to lose than Richard Bantry. Miss Marple paused. Veronica Fielding married the colonel believing him a widower. When she learned the truth, she came to England, not to claim the estate, but to make sure that Eleanor Bantry never reappeared to denounce her as the wife of a bigamist. She arrived, found Richard already here, and realized that he had killed his aunt. She decided to let him take the blame, but only after she had secured the money. She looked towards the house. Last night she lured him here, struck him down, and shut him in the trunk. She intended to leave him there until hunger and cold finished what the blow had begun. Then she would have discovered the body, raised the alarm, and watched Richard hanged for 2 murders instead of 1. Graves drew a long breath. "You are sure?" "Quite sure. The footprints are hers." She wore Richard's shooting brogues, taken from his room at the Blue Boar while he was at dinner. A woman's foot is narrower, but in a loose country brogue the difference would not show in soft earth. And the left heel she cut a piece away with a penknife to match the wear on Richard's own shoes. You will find the knife in her handbag and the brogues hidden in her luggage. She rose. Veronica Fielding is a gambler. She has gambled all her life on men, on cards, on the throw of a die. This time she threw double, or quits, and lost. Graves gave rapid orders. Within half an hour, Veronica was arrested in the lounge of the Blue Boar while ordering a pink gin. She made no scene. She only looked once at Miss Marple, standing quietly by the door, and laughed a short, hard sound. "Clever old pussy," she said. "You win." That same afternoon they found Clara's body in the lake, weighed down with the bronze Buddha tied round her neck with picture cord. And in the evening, when the reporters had gone and the village was settling down to a winter of satisfied horror, they brought Eleanor Bantry home. She had been in the false bottom of the brass-bound trunk all the time, hidden beneath a folded blanket and a layer of moth-balled winter coats. The trunk had been specially made for the colonel in India, with a secret compartment for dispatches, or for anything else a soldier might wish to conceal. Eleanor Bantry had died quickly, from a single blow. Her face, in death, was calm and rather stern, the face of a woman who had kept her own counsel to the end. Miss Marple stood beside the bed in the darkened room and looked down at her old friend. "You always hated a fuss, didn't you?" she said softly. "But you made quite sure the truth would come out. The note in the desk, the pendant in the trunk, the shoe on the ice-house step little pointers for someone to follow. You even locked the summer-house door so that no one would look too closely until the right moment." She bent and touched the cold hand very lightly. "Sleep quietly, my dear." Outside, the frost was hard under the stars, and the old apple tree stood bare and secret, keeping its own counsel now. Chapter 8. Tea and Explanations. A week later the village had returned, outwardly at least, to its usual calm. The reporters had departed for fresh sensations. The police had rolled up their tape and taken away their placards. Rowan Bank stood empty again, its curtains drawn and its gate chained. Richard Bantry, recovered from concussion but facing charges of murder and attempted fraud, had been removed to Much Benham Jail. Veronica Fielding, once Veronica Mary Bantry, once simply Ronnie Fielding of the wrong side of Nairobi, waited in the women's wing of the same establishment, charged as accessory after the fact and with the attempted murder of Richard Bantry. The inquest on Mrs. Eleanor Bantry and Clara had been opened and adjourned. The coroner had spoken gravely of persons at present in custody. Lynstock Priors digested it all with the solemn satisfaction of a cat licking cream from its whiskers. On the Wednesday afternoon, the Blue Parrot tea rooms were fuller than they had been for years. Mrs. Dane Callery had invited a select party to celebrate what she called the clearing up of the whole dreadful business, and Miss Talbot had excelled herself with plum cake and a new blend of Assam tea. Miss Marple sat in her usual corner by the fern, knitting something pale pink and complicated. Dr. Haydock was there, and the vicar, and Miss Hurst, and of course Mrs. Dane Callery herself, who had recovered from her heart murmur with remarkable speed. "Well," began Mrs. Dane Callery, lowering her voice only enough to ensure that the occupants of the next table could hear perfectly, "I always said there was something queer about that house. All those years with the door shut. And the milk bottles. If only poor Mrs. Bantry had opened her door just once." "She opened it," said Miss Marple gently. "On the wrong evening?" Mrs. Dane Callery waited expectantly. The whole table waited. Miss Marple laid her knitting in her lap. Richard Bantry arrived from Kenya on the 10th of October. He had written to his aunt asking for money. She had refused. He knew she kept a considerable sum in the house. The colonel had never trusted banks after the crash of '31, and he was desperate. Coffee prices had collapsed. He was in debt to half Nairobi. He came to Rowan Bank after dark, let himself in with the key from under the flower pot, and went straight to the study. Eleanor heard him. She came down in her dressing gown and bedroom slippers. There was a quarrel about money, about the bigamous marriage, about everything that had rankled for years. Richard lost his temper, picked up the bronze Buddha, and struck her. One blow. She fell without a sound. Clara came in at that moment. She had been to evening service at the chapel. Richard killed her too, with the same weapon. Then he set to work to cover his traces. He carried Eleanor's body to the summer house and hid it in the false bottom of the old dispatch trunk. He put one of her shoes on the ice-house steps to suggest a disappearance, and began the fiction of the milk bottles. Every morning he cycled down before anyone was about, added another bottle, and knocked loudly. The cat he fed through the scullery window. He intended to wait a decent interval, then discover that his aunt had vanished, and take possession as next of kin. But Eleanor had been beforehand with him. When she found the Nairobi letters in the apple tree, she guessed that someone might try to silence her. She left the note in the desk and the emerald pendant in the trunk as signposts. She even locked the summer-house door so that the trunk would not be opened too soon. Then Veronica arrived. She had seen the English newspapers in Mombasa, realized that Eleanor was dead, and came to claim what she could. She found Richard in possession, and understood at once what he had done. Instead of giving him away, she decided to use him. She would wait until he was firmly established as heir, then blackmail him for half the estate, or, if he proved difficult, denounce him and claim the money herself as the colonel's lawful widow. Richard, meanwhile, discovered the Nairobi marriage certificate. That finished Veronica's claim and made him sole heir. He decided to get rid of her. He typed the anonymous note on a machine he found in the stationer's. He bought a ream of blue Basildon bond at the same time and left it under her door. Veronica, however, was quicker-witted. She saw the trap, waited until Richard was on his way to the summer house, followed him wearing his own stolen brogues, struck him down, and shut him in the trunk to die. She planned to discover him later and let the police draw their own conclusions. What neither of them had counted on was Eleanor Bantry's passion for tidiness. She had left everything in order, even to the pointing out of her own hiding-place. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. "Murder," she said placidly, "is like an untidy drawer. Sooner or later, someone is bound to open it and see what is inside." There was a long silence. Outside, The church clock struck 4. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. And the cat? Field Marshal is living with Clara's sister in Much Benham. He has put on nearly a pound already, and answers to the name of Monty. Mrs. Dane Callery gave a little shiver of delicious horror. All that wickedness in our quiet little village. My dear, said Miss Marple, counting stitches, there is wickedness everywhere. Only sometimes it wears a uniform, or a cherry-red coat, or a soldier's mustache. But underneath it is always the same. She finished her row, snipped the wool with small silver scissors, and smiled round the table with great mildness. Another cup of tea, Mrs. Dane Callery? Miss Talbot has made it exactly right today. And in the quiet lane outside, Rowan Bank stood silent behind its clipped beech hedge, its windows blind, its door shut forever on the secrets it had kept so long.